Money was the most dangerous weapon in the ancient world, and the one that quietly broke more empires than swords or spears ever did. Not tactics, not bravery, not even great generals. Payment, or more precisely, the system that kept soldiers willing to stand, march, and kill on command. Empires rarely collapsed the moment they lost a battle. They collapsed when they lost the ability to reward the men carrying their shields. When pay stopped feeling fair or reliable, loyalty vanished faster than belief, culture, or fear. This is where power truly lived. Welcome to a history where economics decide survival, where armies follow incentives, and where collapse begins long before the walls fall. Long before banks, income taxes, or central banks, rulers faced the same brutal problem. How do you support massive armed forces year after year without modern finance? Soldiers never fought for ideals alone. They fought because service promised something tangible: land for retirement, food for families, social status, or direct payment they could trust. Once armies stopped being temporary militias and became permanent institutions, war stopped being seasonal. It became a continuous expense. Ancient states could not print endlessly or borrow without limits. When the treasury emptied, there was no safety net, no emergency lender, no reset button. Every empire was forced to tie military power to something real: metal pulled from the ground, land seized through conquest, labor extracted from populations, or tribute demanded through fear. These choices shaped civilizations, deciding who prospered, who suffered, and who paid the price when it cracked. No civilization pushed the mechanics of military payment further than Rome. At its height, the empire supported a permanent force of hundreds of thousands of soldiers stretched across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. This was not a temporary levy raised for a single campaign. It was a standing institution that existed every day, whether Rome was at war or not, and that institution ran on expectation. Soldiers expected regular wages, predictable rewards, and a future that justified decades of service. Roman power did not rest on emotion or loyalty to the state. It rested on reliability. As long as soldiers believed their compensation would arrive on time and hold value, Rome functioned. The borders held. The roads stayed open. Order was enforced. But that reliability depended on something fragile: silver. The Roman military was paid in denarii, silver coins that carried the authority of the state stamped directly into metal. These coins were not symbolic. They were tangible proof that service had meaning. Taxes were collected in them, trade relied on them. Trust in Rome itself was tied to their weight and purity. But silver had to come from somewhere. Rome's expansion was not just political or defensive, it was financial. Conquests in regions like Hispania were driven by access to rich mining zones capable of feeding the empire's appetite for precious metal. As long as new silver entered circulation, the system held together. Money moved outward to soldiers and inward through taxes and trade, creating a self-reinforcing loop of power. Eventually, that loop tightened, mining costs rose, easily accessible deposits were exhausted. Meanwhile, military expenses increased as borders expanded and threats multiplied. Rome faced a structural mismatch: growing obligations supported by a shrinking resource base. Instead of redesigning the system, leaders altered the appearance of stability. Coins looked unchanged, but their silver content quietly declined. At first, the difference was invisible. Over time, it became unavoidable. Prices rose. Wages lost meaning. Soldiers noticed before civilians did. The state responded by increasing nominal pay, using even weaker currency. Inflation spread outward, taxing those with no voice while protecting those closest to power. What had once been a monetary system became a mechanism of quiet extraction. Rome's crisis was not merely economic, it was political. As money lost credibility, so did the state that issued it. Soldiers adapted quickly. Loyalty shifted away from institutions and toward individuals who could deliver immediate reward. Emperors rose and fell not by legitimacy, but by access to resources. Military power stopped serving Rome's long-term stability and began serving its own survival. The civilian population absorbed the consequences. Taxes intensified. Trade destabilized. Savings eroded. The burden of sustaining the army was redistributed downward, away from the soldiers and onto those least able to resist. This was not announced as a reform. It unfolded through necessity, compromise, and denial. Each decision appeared temporary. Together they hollowed the system. By the 3rd century, monetary payment itself began to break down. Soldiers were compensated with food, land, and localized guarantees rather than reliable currency. The economy fragmented. Trust dissolved. Rome did not collapse in a single moment. It unraveled as its payroll outgrew its capacity to support it. This pattern was not uniquely Roman. It appeared wherever armies were paid through expansion rather than sustainable revenue. The Assyrian Empire built its military around conquest itself. Soldiers were rewarded through plunder, captives, and redistributed land. Cities that resisted were dismantled economically to sustain the next campaign. Violence was not incidental, it was the funding mechanism. As long as expansion continued, the system reinforced itself. Fear reduced resistance. Success paid for future success. But when expansion slowed, incentives collapsed. Armies conditioned to constant reward had no patience for restraint. Internal revolts replaced external conquest. The machine consumed itself. A similar logic shaped early Islamic empires, though with more administrative structure. Soldiers received stipends funded by taxes extracted from conquered territories. Growth was not optional, it was essential. When borders stabilized, costs rose faster than revenue. Political unity fractured as financial strain replaced military momentum. Expansion had delayed the problem. It had not solved it. In every case, the method of payment shaped the fate of the empire. Money, loot, or land did not simply fund armies. They defined who held power when resources tightened. Not all empires relied primarily on currency or conquest. Some relied on administration. Under the Han Dynasty, China developed a system that replaced large-scale monetary payment with organized extraction. Taxes were paid in grain, cloth, and labor. Entire populations were mobilized to support military logistics through mandatory service. Soldiers were supplied directly from state grants. Campaigns were planned around supply chains rather than treasure reserves. The system was efficient and resilient, but it transferred enormous cost onto civilians. Generations lived under permanent obligation, sustaining wars they would never witness. Stability depended entirely on administrative strength. When central authority weakened, the system collapsed as decisively as any monetary failure. Other empires removed money almost entirely. The Aztec state compensated warriors through status and tribute rights. Conquered cities delivered goods and captives on rigid schedules. Military campaigns were designed to enforce compliance rather than expand territory. The army functioned as both enforcer and collector. This system worked only while extraction remained uninterrupted. There was no surplus, no buffer, no flexibility. When tribute failed, collapse was immediate. Without flow, there was nothing to redistribute. Power vanished overnight. Across civilizations, the pattern remained consistent. Armies were never paid in abstraction. They were paid with metal, land, labor, or lives. Each method reshaped society around it. Each carried hidden costs, and each failed when the burden exceeded what the population could sustain. Understanding how armies are paid reveals where power truly resides. When payment systems strain, loyalty fractures first. Collapse follows later. Empires rarely fall because they lose wars. They fall because the systems that fund force become unsustainable long before the fighting stops. This is the moment where history stops feeling distant and starts feeling personal. We like to believe modern states escaped the limits that trapped ancient empires. Today, armies are funded through budgets and spreadsheets, not silver or plunder. Salaries appear on screens. Weapons are financed through contracts that stretch decades into the future. Wars are paid for quietly, through borrowing instead of conquest. But when you remove the modern terminology, the foundation looks familiar. Military spending remains politically untouchable. When money grows scarce, social services are questioned first. Defense budgets are preserved. Inflation continues to absorb costs that governments prefer not to explain openly. Debt takes the place of tribute. Financial institutions replace minds, and once again, the burden settles on people who had no real say in how the system was built. The technology changed, the incentives did not. Inflation today performs the same function currency dilution once did. It allows obligations to be met without visible tax increases. It slowly transfers value away from wages and savings, and it shields those closest to the flow of money from the consequences felt by everyone else. A system that relies on invisible pressure to fund visible force is not as stable as it claims to be. The greatest danger isn't that history repeats itself. It's that familiarity makes it harder to recognize. Empires rarely collapse from a single defeat. They weaken when the cost of maintaining power grows heavier than the societies supporting it. Collapse arrives quietly through declining trust, strained cohesion, and systems that no longer feel fair. This is why economic history matters, not as theory, as awareness. Because once you understand how power is funded, you start to see who is protected when systems bend. and who absorbs the damage when they finally break. If this changed how you see history and the present, stay with the channel. The past explains more than we're taught to notice.